Good evening, can you all hear me? That's always a promising start. Welcome everyone, it's an absolute pleasure to see so many of you this evening. My name is Ben Ryan, I'm one of the researchers here at Theos Think Tank, and as is traditional, there are a few housekeeping notes before we get underway. The first thing is there shouldn't be a fire. If there is, do feel free to escape. There are doors there, and there. Use any of them that you like, really. If you're a tweeter, there is a hashtag for this evening, which is hashtag Putney Common Good. Putney Common Good, if you're into tweeting. And the last housekeeping note is that tonight's event is being filmed. So if you're not comfortable having a question on camera, it might be best if you didn't ask one. It's wonderful, though, to be able to welcome you here. This is an amazingly appropriate venue. This is the home of the 1647 Putney debates, which happened just in the aftermath of the Civil War, once the political establishment had been well and truly torn down and something needed to be put in its place. It sounds a little bit like now. And it's perhaps with that in mind that this is going to be the host of the first of 3 events which we're going to be holding here. I should say all these events are being sponsored by CCLA, which is one of the many banners behind me. CCLA is one of the UK's leading ethical fund managers. It handles investments for over 40,000 charity, churches and public sector organisations, and they are the largest manager of socially responsible funds in the UK. As I say, this is the first of 3 debates, which are all going to be held on the future and present role of the state and our relationship to it. This one is on migration. There will be one on the family in November and one on the church and community in March. And if you'd like to know about those, do sign up to any of the newsletters of any of the organisations involved in this at the end. As you came in, you'll have noticed there is a bookstall and things from all the organisations which are involved. Do please look at that, and perhaps particularly look at this, if you're interested in this topic. This is Fortress Britain, Ethical Approaches to Immigration Policy for a Post-Brexit Britain. And 2 of the contributors to it are on the panel, and another one is dressed as a Dominican over there. So do please buy that if you're interested. The organisations that are hosting it tonight are threefold. There is my organisation, Theos. We are a Christian think tank which provides research, events and comment around the place of religion in public life. And we're delighted to be joined for this in partnership with the Benedict XVI Centre at St Mary's University, which is a research hub which is looking at understanding research on sociological trends in religious practice, and Together for the Common Good, which is an emerging movement served by a small charity bringing alive the principles of the common good and encouraging people of goodwill to work together across their differences. And that's very much in the spirit of what we're doing here this evening. We want this debate to be perhaps slightly different from the way in which migration debates have been run in the past. We want to embody something of the common good, and by that we mean our flourishing, our ability to live together as a society. And we don't mean that in some sort of trite utopian way, but rather in how do we work across our differences? How do we build things up together? And that's more than enough introduction from me. I'm going to hand over to our chair for this evening, who is Theos's director, Elizabeth Oldfield.
Ben, thank you. Ben modestly didn't mention that he edited said volume, and it is highly recommended. I am so delighted that you're here tonight, and I want to be really clear that you are so welcome here whichever way you voted on the referendum. Tonight is not about rerunning the arguments of Brexit. I think we've probably all had quite enough of that. And I won't be allowing any name-calling, any tribal factionalism or contempt to seep through when we talk about these issues, difficult and emotive as they sometimes are. Passion is fine, contempt is not. If you've come here spoiling for a fight about Brexit, then you might be disappointed. Because when we talk about the common good, one of the things that we mean is that if we take seriously the size and complexity of the challenges that face us, it should become clear that we need all of our best brains, all of our best hearts, all of our best hands, no matter where you sit on the political spectrum. So I would urge you at the outset, panel included, myself included, to open your ears, especially to those speakers that you may instinctively assume that you don't agree with, and give them the benefit of the doubt. We're going to try not to use tonight as an opportunity for us all to be confirmed in our pre-existing positions, but rather be challenged and informed. And it's actually really hard to do. There's a discipline in that, and I am far from perfect on it, but I want to encourage us all to give it a try. As I'm sure all of us are aware by now, alongside climate change, to which it is related, Immigration is our most significant global issue. In the aftermath of the UK's referendum, there is both a need and an opportunity for us to develop a new way of managing the movement of people, given that population flows, as they're known in policy speak, or in more human terms, people needing to leave where they are and be somewhere else, or at the very least wanting to be where they are and be somewhere else, is a trend that is likely to only increase. So the key questions we've asked our panels to reflect on tonight are: post-Brexit, how should the British state handle migration policy to best accommodate the interests of our different communities? What should that mean for integration? How can we better imagine a common life together? And therefore, what might a good immigration policy that serves the common good look like? As you can see, we have 5 excellent speakers, and I'm very grateful for them all for giving up the time to think and prepare this and come to Putney tonight to be with us. Particularly since, before I introduce them, I'm going to lay out how this is going to go, and I have already apologised to them that I'm going to be quite a strict chair tonight. Because there's 5 of them, and because we want to reflect the spirit of the Putney debates and have this as not an expert-led downloading kind of conversation, but a genuine debate and dialogue with you, I'm going to keep them to very short 8-minute contributions to begin with. And you will hear an alarm go off when that's gone, and I will pass them a note which says wrap up. So I'm hoping to use social shame to see if we can keep to time. I have asked them to avoid jargon or acronyms, and I will step in and get them to explain anything. But if anyone said anything that you don't understand, just wave your hand, and I will ask them to explain it for you. We don't want, again, to have a conversation from which people feel excluded. Following that, we will open to the floor, and we'd love to hear your questions. I'll take them in groups of 3, and obviously the speakers shouldn't feel they need to respond to all of them. Finally, and most importantly, for those of you dashing to get trains, we will finish at 8:30 on the dot. I am pathologically prompt. Everyone will need a glass of wine and some canapes at the end. I really hope you'll stay with us for that. And Kieran has to dash off at that point, so if you see her scuttling out of the door, don't be worried that we've offended her. It's because we need to get her on a train back to where she lives. So very briefly, I'm going to introduce our guests, because in the age of Google, you can find out more about them yourselves. We're going to start with Dr. Adrian Pabst, who's here on my right. He is a reader in politics in the School of Politics and International Relations at the University of Kent. I'm then going to go over here to Satbir Singh, who is the CEO of the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants. Following that, we're going to have Dr. Anne Kirshen, who is the founding director of the Centre for the Study of Migration at Queen Mary University of London. David Goodhart will speak following that, who is the head of demography, immigration and integration at Policy Exchange. And on the end, finally, we'll have Kieran Barley, who is the chair of the United Religions Initiative. There's much more I could say about all of those distinguished guests, so I would encourage you to go away and read about them. That's all from me. So with no further ado, I'm going to pass this microphone along to Adrian and ask him to kick us off.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and can I thank all 3 organisers for the invitation. It's really wonderful to be here, and can I say a special word of thanks to Ben for putting this together. Publishing edited collections is probably the least pleasant thing in the world of publishing, because unless you get goodwill from your contributors, it's really the person's worst nightmare. So thank you, Ben, for that, and it's a terrific volume. I thought I'd start with the question of democracy, given where we are and given the history of this beautiful church hall. So the first thing to say about migrations, I think that for too long, some very reasonable concerns about the volume and the pace of immigration here, but also elsewhere in Europe, as I think a lot of election results now suggest, those concerns have been ignored. And I think that not only is a problem for how to deal with migration, but also has corrosive effects on democracy, because people end up losing trust in political institutions and in elected politicians and others. So the first thing to say is immigration is, and has been for some time, one of the biggest issues in political and democratic debate. And I do some work with some Labour MPs for, I was going to say for all my sins, but that doesn't sound quite right. But they have always, told me this story from the 2015 election campaign, where they were instructed by party headquarters that if anyone raised immigration on the doorstep, that they should change subject. So in essence, the message was, no, immigration isn't a problem. What you're really worried about is jobs. What you're really worried about is housing. What you're really worried about is health. But that's no way of dealing with voters and with citizens. So that's really the first point to make. But democracy isn't only about majority will or the sovereignty of the people, though that is an important component. But democracy is also about how we live together, including with people with whom we passionately disagree over Brexit and over other issues. And democracy is about more than just coexistence. It's also about forming some civic or social bonds, because after all, without those bonds, there's no trust. Without trust, there's no cooperation. And again, democracy is in big trouble. And finally, democracy is also about notions of flourishing. How does democracy help me, help you, help every one of us to flourish and lead a good life? And on that basis, I think, looking at immigration, we get a rather different perspective than just a question of numbers. Do we need a target in the 10,000s or in the 100,000s? Or, the idea that somehow if you even raise the question, you're already bigoted or a racist just for even bringing it up. Because ultimately, democracies can't just be run on, I think, the two dominant conceptions of justice that we've had in the last few decades. One is just about utility. It's basically saying, as long as the aggregate effect is positive, we don't worry about the rest. So if the overall effect of immigration is good for the economy, why should we worry? We can just address the little concerns by, distributing a bit of money here and maybe managing it in a sort of top-down way. And that's, I think, not right. Nor is the idea that somehow immigration is just about freedoms or individual rights. Because again, democracy involves much more. Democracy involves notions of the common good, because that's what a good life and flourishing is all about. And the common good isn't just the aggregation of individual goods. It's basically all the relationships we have in common, all the relational goods that we can only have by working together. And that really comes, I think, largely from Catholic social teaching and cognate traditions in other Christian churches and denominations. And that's really about two or three important things I want to raise very quickly, and then I'll conclude with some concrete proposals. The first is the dignity of the person, that we're not just isolated individuals somehow bound together by contract or right, but rather that there's something intrinsically worthwhile about each and every one of us. So it is about equality, but it's about the intrinsic worth of human beings. And that means we are not just reducible to being commodities. So migrants shouldn't just be seen as people who have skills, and that's why we want some of them, but not others. They are also people with intrinsic worth, and we shouldn't just reduce that to some economic utility or value. The common good isn't simply about, as I said, just adding up things. It's about what enables us to live and flourish together. So it's about much more than just wealth or power. It's about that which enables us to live out all of our talents, our vocations, and be valued as unique persons. And then there's this point about mutual obligations, that we can't have a democracy which is just about individual rights or entitlements. You don't just take from society, you also give something, you make a contribution. And you don't just get owed something, you also owe something to others and to society as a whole. And you can't really treat people who've just come into the country as people who deserve exactly the same as someone who's made a contribution for 30, 40, 50 years. That is in some sense a violation of a natural sense of justice. A contribution, right, is something that deserves some sort of reward. Now, people in extreme hardship, of course, deserve our help, of course, deserve our compassion and our assistance. But when it comes to social housing for economic migrants, you can't just say, well, they've just come into the country, they'll just jump the queue, and someone else who's been waiting for 10 years, will wait for another 5 or 10 years. And if you think this is a political point, it isn't. It comes straight out of the teaching of the Catholic Church, and I just want to read one quote by Pope Francis, because Pope Francis is often portrayed as someone who's just in favor of migrants and has nothing to say about, if you like, the other side. Absolutely not true. Here's what he says: "The Church stands at the side of all who work to defend each person's right to live with dignity, first and foremost by exercising the right not to emigrate and to contribute to the development of one's own country of origin." In other words, what the Pope is saying is, wherever possible, we want to help people where they already are. And we want to help them because we owe it to them if they live in hardship, to help them where they are, but also because it's better for them to stay in their societies. If they want to, and if it's no civil war and no persecution, why should they only be able to lead a better life by coming to us? Most people don't want to leave their home country. They want to flourish with the people with whom they've grown up. And if there is no, as I said, reason like civil war or persecution, then perhaps it's better to help them than to, in some sense, say, well, we'll help them when they come over here. Think of all the risks involved in the journeys, the way it enriches the smugglers, etc., etc. And so what does that mean in concrete terms? Very briefly, because I've only got a minute left. It means distinguishing refugees who genuinely need our help and who I think we should welcome and be very compassionate and generous with from economic migrants. Now, that won't work for all cases, but it will work for a lot of cases. And I think that is a distinction we need to be very clear about. Secondly is offer real sanctuary to those who suffer persecution or who are fleeing a civil war. Be very, generous. Of course, help them with integrating, into our societies, but certainly provide proper protection and sanctuary. Thirdly, help migrants where they are. So really make sure that development aid and everything that the NGOs do, which is very important, helps people where they are. Doesn't mean that 80% of the money that we give in development aid will flow back to British or American or other businesses. It has to help the people where they live. Otherwise, they will probably want to leave their home country and come here. And finally, it also means helping those who are here to integrate, and in exchange for help, language training, skills, and so on, also really make sure that they integrate, that they embrace the culture they live in, that they're able to make a contribution at some point so that it's not just a one-way street. And finally, help people who are here, indigenous or immigrant, to get the skills, to get the housing, to get the school places and the health service so that they don't feel that somehow development is at their expense. In other words, Catholic social teaching and other Christian traditions really think about that idea of reciprocity. Right? Yes, we help you when you need it, but you also have to make a contribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Pass this along.
There we are. Into Chris. Okay, right, there we are. Thank you to Elizabeth, to Theos, to the hosts of this evening, and to fellow panelists, and to everybody for coming this evening. I think Elizabeth really struck the right note when she sort of pointed out that immigration and immigration control and immigration policy really are among the most important issues for people, not just in this country, but all over the industrial world or the post-industrial world, however you want to look at it. It certainly played one of, if not the most significant roles in the referendum. And as we prepare to leave the European Union, it's both a responsibility and an opportunity to rethink some of the basic features of our immigration system, because it will obviously, our relationship at the border with other countries is going to be transformed quite significantly over the coming few years. Thinking about this, and I'm grateful to Adrian for pointing out that there have been points at which we have failed to discuss migration, immigration. It's a sensitive issue, and when we depoliticize issues, we take them out of the sphere of public contest, and therefore we don't have a healthy discussion about them. It's very difficult to separate our thoughts and our observations about policy from our observations about the politics of migration. So as much as we want to discuss the systems that we'll put into place, it's equally important to discuss the way in which we discuss migration, the way in which evidence plays a role in that, the language that we use. Attitudes and anxieties and emotions and thoughts, the stuff of pollsters or elections, these do shape policy, and that's how democracy works. But insofar as we discuss the politics of this, it's also important to note that the way we discuss a policy issue will shape attitudes over time. And that's just the way politics works in an open society. And there are, of course, points at which, for decades, one might say for at least the decade or 2 decades through the New Labour period and onwards, that we didn't discuss migration, but there are also points at which we've discussed it in a very unhealthy way, and we've gone from one extreme to the other. So we've gone from an absolute silence about this issue to one in which we catastrophize the issue of immigration at every turn. And the politics and the policy have, over that period, brought us to the current juncture at which there are two realities that we face in our immigration system. The first of these is that there is no trust in government to manage immigration in a manner that is efficient, fair, or humane, or to the satisfaction of any of the stakeholders to this debate, to the satisfaction of those who have anxieties about immigration and think that it should be brought down significantly, or to the satisfaction of those who perhaps favour a slightly less restrictive or more permissive environment at the border. And no party in government at this point could reasonably command the trust of the public on immigration. Once these immigration is out of control and you have a system of targets which have been arbitrarily set, which are perpetually missed, and so it is quite understandable that a sizable percentage of the population view immigration as something that is out of control, because on any policy goal, out of control, uncontrolled, is obviously to the detriment of somebody. Controlled is always better, but what does control mean? And on the other side of this debate, you've got people who work within the immigration system, people who use the immigration system, or whose loved ones, employees, colleagues use the immigration system, and what they see as a system that is deeply inhumane and inefficient. So you've got a situation in which neither of the two positions on this are terribly happy with what we've got in front of us. Neither of them are satisfied, and nobody really wins at this point. And it's a polarizing issue, and that's the second big reality that we've got to face, that immigration as an issue is polarizing in a way that it doesn't necessarily need to be. Lots of issues are polarizing or divisive, and we've all just seen an extended debate about a third runway at Heathrow Airport. But why is it so important that we talk about the polarizing nature of the immigration debate? And it's because the immigration debate or discussions about immigration are discussions that touch on so many other issues, including the question of who counts as us and who counts as them, who is us and who is the other, what are the rights and entitlements that these different groups have. And ultimately this idea of the common good, because ultimately this is the question of how are 60 or 70 million of us going to live together on this island? And that's why the immigration debate is so central, because it is dangerous over a period of time for us to remain this polarized on this issue, and there does need to be a move towards some form of consensus, whether that involves concessions from those who perhaps favor open borders or less restrictive policies, or from those who have a target in mind or have a policy which sees immigration as an end goal of policy. To my mind, and you'll find this strange given that I work in an organization with the word immigrants in the title, I don't think immigration is a policy goal. I think immigration has become a policy issue, but really when we're talking about immigration, we're talking about several other issues lumped together. We're talking about opportunity in the economy and the dispersion of opportunity in the economy. We're talking about cohesive communities and integration, which, though inextricably linked to immigration, is a debate unto itself. And what we've got to do is de-link some of these things when we think about how we build an immigration system after Brexit. And just briefly, because I've got 2 minutes and 9 seconds, I will outline a few short principles of what an immigration system that works for the common good might look like at this juncture. The first of these is that our immigration system, the laws and policies that govern our border, must be based on evidence, and the goals that govern those policies must be realistic. If we set a policy, we have to ask ourselves, is there a real need or a problem that this is fixing? Does this policy fix it, and is it a realistic goal? Because if we set targets that we miss year after year after year, we erode confidence in the system. If we set policies which are needlessly restrictive, needlessly harsh, violate all sorts of rights, but are known at the time to not really work and won't necessarily deliver our policy goal, then we break that consensus for no really good reason at the end of the day. The second is that policy must protect and promote the rule of law. Once we've determined, and our organisation has sort of stepped out of the debate on numbers and what the flows of people across our border should be, once we've determined what groups of people are and aren't allowed to come in, it shouldn't be impossibly complicated for those who are, in fact, eligible to enter the country. It shouldn't require people to use an expensive lawyer in order to take up a job that they've been offered which allows them status in the country under Tier 2, or to join a spouse who does in fact earn above the state's minimum income requirement. It should not be this difficult for either the applicant or for the state. We should not be in a situation in which judges find 51% of Home Office decisions that come to them are in fact wrong. It shouldn't be that complicated. No community should be left behind, and this is Adrian's point about averages. There is no one-size-fits-all approach, and there must be a mechanism for regions to provide feedback on migration needs. Non-migration policy becomes critical here. We need a mechanism by which the benefits of migration, be they fiscal or economic, are kept in communities so that communities that receive higher flows of migration see some of those benefits. And finally, immigration policy should encourage long-term integration and stable, cohesive communities, and this includes making pathways to citizenship significantly more navigable to avoid the situation we're in now where several 100,000 people have fallen out of our immigration system and are essentially undocumented as a result. These are perhaps just very abstract, basic principles, but I think they provide a useful starting point if we want to talk about building a cohesive, sensible immigration policy that works for everybody, migrant and non-migrant alike.
Thank you. Do feel free to applaud after people's short talks as we pass the microphone along.
Right, I've been given dispensation to talk for 10 minutes because the government keeps moving the goalposts and I've had to change what I've written about every other day. I'm going to be much more specific. My talk is on Brexit and the future of migration with a focus on London's East End. London's East End has been a traditional first point of settlement for centuries. In most instances, and there of course have been exceptions which we can discuss later, when the migrant presence becomes too visible and too numerous, compassion and tolerance turn to intolerance and discrimination. At the end of the 17th century, having donated money to help the Huguenot refugees, Samuel Pepys remarked, "We do naturally all hate the French." Concern over numbers and the migrant impact on national identity is not new to the 21st century. In 1892, the Reverend Rini, referring to Eastern European Jews in the East End, stated, "In face, instinct, language and character, their children are aliens. They seldom become citizens." In 1982, the focus was on Bangladeshis. One East Ender complained that the children of white council tenants were being forced out of the area in order to make way for the coloured people. At a racist-inspired meeting 2 years later, a local resident recommended that you put all these people, these were Bangladeshis, in Fairfoot Road and I'll drop a petrol bomb on them. These quotations highlight the way in which, though the temporal context may change, xenophobic fears follow a repeat pattern, one which makes few allowances for the benefits of the migrant presence. In the run-up to the 2016 referendum, this fact was illustrated by the way in which immigration was cited by many as being the main advantage of leaving the EU. We need to take back control of our borders and control immigration. The complexity of monitoring who was coming in and who was going out, and from where to where, was never considered. Brexiteers focused on the negative impact immigrants were having on national identity, housing, jobs, and overcrowding in our schools, hospitals, and GP practices. The impressive contributions made to our economy, doing the jobs that Englishmen won't do, while working at all skill levels in medicine and education and other professions, were either ignored or unknown. And this is something I'm sure we can discuss later. Though the East End has long been a gateway to economic opportunity and place of immigrant settlement, following the 2004 and 2007 accessions to the EU, a different pattern of settlement evolved. Recent European newcomers have dispersed throughout the United Kingdom, taking up employment in agriculture, the hospitality sector, in meat packaging, factories, coffee shops and restaurants, as well as in medicine, education and banking. While some acknowledge the benefits, as the pattern of Brexit voting revealed, in England, most of Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland voted to stay in areas where until recently there had been little or no interaction between migrant and indigene, others did not, seeing only the negative aspects of immigration. Brexiteers see a positive Brexit world, convinced that a United Kingdom with severely restricted immigration can provide for all the nation's needs. However, without its immigrant population, our industrial and economic structure, let alone the health, education and manufacturing sectors, will be much the poorer, a concern that's been voiced by many in the fields I referred to. But as our Prime Minister has said, Brexit means Brexit. So what can we anticipate and how should we approach a post-Brexit world? In the brief time I have, I'll focus on two specific areas which will be affected by departure from the EU and see what they are saying. They are higher education and the NHS. In order to do so, I'm taking two institutions in the East End as case studies with data supplied by Queen Mary University of London and the Barts NHS Health Trust. Currently, EU students pay the same fees as those in the UK and have access to tuition loans, preferential fee rates, and are free to find work after study without obtaining a visa. All this is destined to change after Brexit in March 2019. At present, undergraduate fees at Queen Mary are £9,250 a year for home and EU students and £14,500 for those from overseas. In the country as a whole, there are some 135 students from the EU, mainly at Russell Group universities. Now, this is why I had to update, because the government announced last night that students registering for entry to UK universities in 2019 will pay the same fees and receive the same support as at present. However, there's no statement been made yet as what will happen to those wishing to register from 2020 onwards, nor what the long-term reciprocal arrangements for UK EU students will be. Queen Mary, in common with others, fears that if EU students are not charged at a beneficial rate, then it and other institutions of its calibre will be in direct competition with prestigious universities in Australia and America. Queen Mary is currently forecasting that recruitment from the richest EU countries could decline by 2/3, and from poorer countries, for example Romania, it might cease. The university is free, as are others, to set its own rates, so it could maintain the status quo and offer EU students the same rate after Brexit. However, all the other benefits would be lost. Another major unknown lies with the Erasmus scheme post-Brexit. This enables EU students from 32 European countries to go and study for a year in another member country. The UK is the third and most popular in the scheme, with 30,000 students coming to the UK in 2015 and 40,000 of our students going to Europe. At present, it's unclear how the Erasmus scheme will be affected by Brexit, but it has been said that the departure of Britain will undermine its framework. It is not only at student level that higher education will be affected. The prevailing uncertainty has filtered through to EU academic staff. The head of the School of Politics and IR at QMUL has told me of the concerns of some of his excellent EU colleagues feeling unwanted and unsure as to whether they will acquire leave to remain, i.e. settled status. Some have indeed encountered delays and difficulties when applying. This unease is also undermining those both applying for and awarding pan-European research grants, which include researchers from the UK. The current EU research pot, in which the UK shares, is £89 billion, rising to £100 billion after 2021. Uncertainty in higher education will lose opportunities and the best of the best. Losing the best of the best is a facet of the concerns facing the NHS. 10% of its doctors and 5% of its nurses are from the EU. As with academics, there's concern about obtaining leave to remain after Brexit, and others feel a sense of being unwelcome and are considering returning to their home countries, and I've met quite a few. At the Barts NHS Health Trust, there are 1,700 staff from the EU, and the Trust acknowledges the uncertainty that exists. Its website gives guidance as to how to apply for British citizenship and settled status, but there are a number of processes to go through, and not all those in the Trust, as in hospitals elsewhere, any longer feel comfortable in a post-Brexit Britain. In addition, the Trust reports difficulties in recruitment within the impending context of Brexit. As well as a result of European students feeling unwelcome, there's been a decline of 16% in European students applying to the Trust Medical School in 2017-18. There is no doubt that the feeling of insecurity and of being unwelcome persists in all areas where there are European migrant workers. Some are considering going home, others are unsure, though there are those that say they will stay in Britain. Britain is their home. EU citizens are still entering the UK, though that number is falling, while that of those leaving is on the increase. In a climate in which politicians, business executives and professionals in both Britain and the EU are expressing their concern about post-Brexit Britain and the degree of uncertainty that persists, we all need to look carefully at the contribution immigrants make, both from the EU and elsewhere, sort out the good migrants from the bad migrants, and ensure that Britain continues to welcome those from overseas who help make Britain great. From the foregoing, I think you can guess which side of the Brexit fence I'm on. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Pass that along to David.
Well, thank you very much. I just want to start by looking at the bigger picture. We tend to have this image of the world on the move, and we have to protect ourselves by raising barriers and preventing people coming here. Well, yes, I think we do have to do that. I think if we had no borders at all, tens, if not hundreds of millions of people would try to come here. There is some evidence from opinion surveys on that. But I think we need to recall that it's only about 3.5% of the world's population who live permanently in countries other than the one they were born in. The world is not actually on the move. As I think Adrian said earlier, the vast majority of people want to stay in their countries and want to develop them, want to reach the kind of levels of wealth and freedom and openness that that our society has achieved over many hundreds of years, starting with that wonderful quote perhaps in 1647. But it is also true that numbers have risen somewhat in recent years, the last 20 or 30 years in particular, and actually that is rather that is the consequence of a very welcome development, which is that many of the world's poorer countries have got a great deal richer. They have quite large middle classes now, with the assets, with the ability to at least try to move, albeit in some cases by paying traffickers. People, because the world is now so much more visible and transparent through the internet and so on, many people in poorer countries, rather than are impatient, understandably impatient, to have the good life now and not to wait for the 3 or 4 generations that it might take for their countries, say, I don't know, Uganda, say, to become a country that in some ways is like Britain. And as I say, that is a completely understandable thing, but if we allowed that to happen, then I think it would weaken Uganda, because, of course, they would be losing many of their most educated and dynamic people, and it would, at least over a period of time, help to destroy many of the institutions that we have here if tens of millions of people arrived. Now, obviously that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen because we live in democracies. Our country used to be, indeed still partly was in 1647, owned by monarchs and landowners. It is now, thanks to democracy, owned by its citizens, and its citizens are going to make sure that there will be pretty strict limits on the kind of demographic changes that they are prepared to accept. I don't think that means that we are a polarized society on this issue. Indeed, there is a settled will on this issue, and it has been pretty clearly settled now since large-scale immigration took off again in the late 90s. And that settled will, which covers about 70-75% of the population, think that immigration has either been much too high or a little bit too high over recent years. People do have all sorts of exaggerated views of, say, I don't know, the number of Muslims who live in Britain and so on. But if you look at the anxieties that people express about immigration, they have risen almost directly in line with the actual figures of people who've been arriving in the last 20 years. And since the numbers have gone down somewhat in the last couple of years, the anxiety levels have gone down too. So this idea that people are ignorant and that the argument is very polarized, it is not very polarized. I mean, there is a very loud voice for the people who I call the people who see the world from anywhere, in the book that I wrote last year called The Road to Somewhere, tends to be people who are highly educated and mobile and have what the famous American sociologist Talcott Parsons called achieved identities, a sense of themselves as sort of self-created people who passed exams when they were young, went to more or less good universities, had more or less good professional careers, and their sense of themselves comes from their own achievements. Not unreasonably, and they have a highly individualistic and sort of portable sense of identity. But the other very large value group, the people who see the world from somewhere, see the world very differently. They tend not to be so well educated, not to be so mobile, and they have mainly ascribed identities. Their sense of themselves comes from their place and their group. And if those things change too rapidly, then their sense of identity can become discomforted. And I think our debate, much of our debate in Britain is dominated, over-dominated by the anywheres who feel very comfortable and are happily mobile, can live pretty well anywhere, and they do not understand the feelings of rootedness. And those feelings, by the way, are no longer mainly expressed in nativist or racist terms. That is one of the other extraordinary things that I think is not sufficiently recognized, is in this last period of 20 years in which we have had historically unprecedented levels of immigration, we've also seen pretty continuous declines in the levels of prejudice that people express. Only 1% of British people say that they feel very prejudiced towards people of other races. Racism is the biggest social taboo there is in this country. A lot of people are anti-mass immigration. Relatively few people are anti-immigrant, I would say. And these are very, very different things. And I think the vast majority of people accept the idea of the moral equality of all human beings, but they think their primary obligation is to their fellow citizens of all races and religions. So, like I say, we've been living in this period of extraordinary openness, and the Home Office receives 2.6 million visa applications every year, when often for very short visits, visitor visas. And we still have net immigration of about 550,000 a year. Like I say, these are absolutely extraordinary levels, and we are going to become a little less open. This degree of openness and the extent to which it was ignored by the anywhere classes is one of the things that has led to Brexit. And people have pushed back. They want a rebalancing. They don't want to live in a closed society. This idea that kind of left v right has been replaced by open v closed is incredibly self-regarding way of looking at it, I think. No one wants to live in a closed society, but they want a form of openness that reflects their interests more. And they don't want to feel that national social contracts have been undermined, as many people do feel. Half the building workers in London come from outside the UK, and we started 8,000 construction apprenticeships last year. This is absolutely absurd situation. And employers have cut their training bills in this country by about anything between 15 and 30% in the last 20 years. So, I think, just to finish, we do want to remain an open society and will remain an open society. I rather welcome the announcement the government has made about students. We want to, and I think the answer is we have more and more temporary movement of people, so we slow down the demographic change that a lot of people feel so disturbed by. We slow down the demographic change, but we still have an openness. Students can still come, people can come and work in the economy too. Thank you. I was the only one who got the bell. No, on the minute. Sorry. Yeah. Are we on?
Forgive me. Oh, I have created a monster. I should say that I gave everyone else a couple of seconds grace because they were clearly finishing up, and I couldn't reach to do that for David. So he did very well. Thank you all. I'm going to hand over to Kieran at the end.
Thank you. A very good evening to you all. It's really good to be part of this important discussion around the future of migration and how we consider an ethical response as we go forward. So we see many benefits of migration, including the influx of labour, capital, innovation, cultural diversity, and that is so enriching for our communities. But we've also seen many challenges around access to public services and the scale of immigration that has unfortunately created silos and social fragmentation. So I'm going to offer a brief dimension on the role of religion towards a new policy, and then we'll talk a little bit about what I think a good policy could look like. So we all know that the religious makeup of the UK is diverse, complex, and multicultural. So whilst religion appeals to many of us by providing a coherent group identity, by providing social and emotional support, we have a number of different religions which may not be uniform in their perspectives within that religion and between the religions as well. Scriptures, we know, can be interpreted very differently by different people. So which religion should have the loudest voice? And could the wide range of religious diversity we have relate to that one voice? I think the answer going forward is in the values that are practiced by people of all religions, and those are the ones that are interchangeable with British values. So rather than the teachings of one religion specifically underpinning national policy, I believe that today's shared religious and interfaith values are the key enablers for an ethical and effective immigration policy to be successful. These shared values focus on how we live and exemplify the principles of kindness, compassion, grace, and humanity for the common good of all. What we're seeing today is religious communities working together more and more. Interfaith action is something which is producing powerful outputs, and places of sanctuary, just like this, places of worship, open day in, day out, supporting people, providing help to those who need it. These places of worship and interfaith sanctuaries of shared values are key areas of kindness, hope, and compassion. And these are the places where we welcome immigrants. And these are the key enablers, I think, interfaith values and places of worship. So what should the actual immigration policy look like? In order to have a functional and effective immigration system, we need it to serve the interests of the indigenous population as well as the immigrants. And this needs to be implemented by the shared interfaith values with the aim of welcoming others and building a common and prosperous life together. So here are the other important aspects. I would add that this should be a qualitative welcome. So this presupposes the expectation that immigrants become fully fledged members of the community and thus integrated and happy members. Controlled immigration is the way forward. Controlled immigration is the only way we can ensure we have a full and thriving workforce which can contribute fully. And the controls also should be around cultural diversity, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and economic status, all of the protected characteristics. It's so important to have a net migration target. The principle of a target will help to hold the government to account and give them a benchmark aim around which policy can be shaped. Improved immigration data is essential. We have seen so many exit checks, so much data which are intended to enable accurate calculations of people coming in and people going out, but they've failed to achieve their purpose. Without accurate figures, no policy can be properly devised or even evaluated. We need active social cohesion efforts and integration. So from my own experience at the grassroots, the language barrier is an important part of this. Common language is a key mechanism for integration and for full participation in the national and political life here. And the immigrants will benefit from the knowledge of the language, and language is also a unifying force and helps to bring friendships. The environment and natural resources sometimes get overlooked when we talk about immigration. We're already very densely populated and heavily urbanized. And so the scale of immigration that we have seen has put increasing pressure on the ability of the land to remain enticing and scenic. We need to think about the increasing urbanization which is threatening biodiversity and species. We need to tackle illegal immigration. It's estimated there are 1 million people in the UK who do not have the legal right to be here. The law of the land must prevail. We need to create a better understanding of asylum seekers and refugees, recognising the complex reality of people's experience of migration, but then establishing fair and efficient ways to judge asylum claims, to follow firm procedures, but also to deport those who don't qualify. And we need a foreign policy that encourages countries of origin and transit to treat people better, ensuring that those who are admitted into the country flourish. Just summing up then, I also want to mention the importance of effectively combating human trafficking, supporting victims of modern slavery and children involved in human trafficking as one of our priorities. That's a key aspect of an immigration policy. And we also need investment in housing and public services. Let us work to ensure there are enough school places, housing arrangements, and support services to support not just the immigrants but the wider community as well. The immigration debate is a timeless one. I feel that Britain is a very welcoming nation with a rich diversity. And to continue to welcome immigrants effectively, we need a scale and a pace that will allow us to do so in the best way possible. Qualitative immigration with the support enablers of interfaith values, underpinned by the foremost responsibility to accommodate the interests of the Indigenous community as partners for more positive outcomes for the whole community. Thank you.